Ever have a flow suddenly stop working and the only clue is a cryptic DLP policy message? You're not alone. Today, we unpack what's really happening when your Power Platform project gets blocked and, more importantly, show you how to avoid it next time. If you want to build smarter without running into roadblocks, you're in the right place. Let's turn DLP policies from mystery obstacles into tools you can use to keep projects on track. Why DLP policies feel like a stop sign, but aren't. If you've ever stared at a failed Power Automate run with nothing but a vague DLP violation error to guide you, you know the feeling. It's not just frustration, it's a kind of developer deja vu. Whatever you build, no matter how well you plan, there's always that lingering risk. Something in the security layer is going to pull the rug out from under your process. Power Platform loves to show you how fast you can go, and then out of nowhere, it drops a stop sign right in the middle of your project. And when that happens, you're left piecing together clues in audit logs at 2 in the morning, while users are already asking why their monthly numbers aren't updating. Let's call it what it is. DLP policies can feel like an invisible hand pushing back every time you try to ship something useful. It's not about developers ignoring security either. Most people working on Power Platform projects know their organizations care about keeping sensitive data safe. Nobody wants internal files uploaded to Dropbox by mistake. What catches people off guard is how unclear the boundaries actually are. You might spend days wiring up a flow, testing edge cases, handling permissions, only for it to break because it tried to use 2 connectors Microsoft's policy engine decided don't play well together. The message that appears gives you maybe 3 words of real information, and the rest might as well be lorem ipsum. A lot of us have been there. Friday rollout, everything set, only to get a Teams ping at midnight. Flow failed, we're back to manual entry. You check the run history, and the only error is a line about DLP compliance checks failing, with no hint if you broke a policy or just tripped up a rule nobody in your org knew existed. That's the thing, it's rarely obvious what caused the block. Microsoft's documentation does explain in theory what each DLP policy does. There's pages about how you're enabling secure data boundaries and protecting business-critical information, which is great in principle. The trouble starts when policy theory bumps into reality. Documentation tells you, sure, you can separate business and non-business connectors, but nobody warns you that adding a single non-business connector to a business process flow can bring everything to a halt. And here's where the disconnect really sets in. The official line is DLP is your friend, secure by design, making sure your flows and apps keep company data safe. But the ground truth is, for developers, DLP policies often feel like a set of rules constantly playing hide and seek. It's not just that they limit what you can build, it's that they don't always tell you what the rules are. Or even better, the policy can change while you're still mid-project, which means something that worked yesterday might be fully blocked today. Plenty of organizations swing too far. Instead of using DLP as a tool to guide smart connector usage, they just lock down everything. Suddenly, Outlook and SharePoint are your only choices in Power Automate, and even Excel Online access is questionable. Productivity tanks, users come back to IT begging for exceptions, and the security team is flooded with tickets that sound the same. Can we please enable this connector for just one project? But what if DLP policies weren't just a blunt instrument to say no? There's a world where they actually help you build more reliable and future-proof solutions. Think of them less like roadblocks and more like guardrails. You're still driving, but now you're less likely to end up in the ditch at the edge of what the platform can safely do. When you understand how DLP shapes what's possible, you can design your apps and flows knowing not only what's allowed today, but what's likely to keep working next month. Instead of reacting to another failed run at midnight, you start building with policy in mind from the beginning. You spend less time firefighting and more time building. Of course, this idea sounds good. In theory, Microsoft says, when configured correctly, DLP policies allow for agile development and secure data flow across your organization. The catch, configured correctly, does a ton of heavy lifting in that sentence. Most developers are never shown what correct looks like during onboarding to Power Platform. You learn it the hard way, one late night troubleshooting session at a time, hoping you don't miss a critical connector classification in some admin spreadsheet. Here's the thing, nobody is suggesting you turn off DLP or hope for a free-for-all. But Organizations that treat these policies as an afterthought usually pay for it later. If DLP is a conversation between platform security and business users, most shops just set it once and forget it until it blows up. You can flip the script though. Instead of waiting for the next surprise, developers who get comfortable talking about connector classifications, policy groups, and usage analytics can build smarter right from the start. So sure, DLP gets a bad reputation for grinding projects to a halt. Underneath all the confusion and friction, though, it's possible to make these policies work for you. They're meant to give you confidence your solutions won't scatter sensitive data across the internet if you treat them as part of your build strategy instead of yet another obstacle. Understanding theory is a helpful start, but the real pain and opportunity shows up with custom connectors. And that's where things get interesting. Custom connectors, where DLP surprises lurk. If you've built a custom connector and watched it vanish from your flow after everything seemed fine, you're definitely not alone. That disappearing act isn't a bug or a bad save, it's your DLP policy at work, but it rarely announces itself. Custom connectors are the secret sauce for a ton of Power Platform projects. Whenever your team wants to talk to an internal API, connect to a niche SaaS tool, or simply bridge two systems that don't natively handshake in Power Automate or Power Apps, a custom connector usually gets the call. For many organizations, these connectors unlock all kinds of business automation that would be impossible otherwise. It feels a bit like finding a cheat code until the day the connector stops showing up in your list and nobody's really sure why. The strange part, custom connectors often sail through initial testing. You build, you connect, you prove the integration works. Your dev and test environments are happy. Everyone signs off on the business logic and the demo goes well. But the real fun starts right as you hit production or scale up usage. One day you set a new flow live that uses that custom connector, and it fails straight away, sometimes without even throwing a proper error. Power Platform's feedback isn't always generous. Sometimes you get a red warning, so connector is not available due to DLP policy. Other times it just quietly removes the connector as an option in your flow editor. Developers start the wild goose chase, checking permissions, reviewing API keys, and even blaming network issues, only to realize the root cause is a policy setting nobody reviewed since the connector was first published. This isn't just a theoretical headache. Here's a real scenario. A developer builds a connector for the company's custom CRM built 15 years back. Everything seems smooth in staging. They showcase the automation to leadership, triggering records, syncing contacts, the works. But when deployment hits, the flow that ran perfectly on Friday refuses to recognize the connector on Monday. The error in the flow run simply says it's been disabled by policy. IT support gets pulled in, and after a half day of cross-checking, they find the custom connector was classified as non-business in the company's DLP settings. That label alone means any flow combining it with a business connector like SQL Server or Outlook instantly breaks the data boundary limit. The developer had no idea labels like this carried so much weight, or that they even existed. The result, lost time, rework, frustrated users, and a workflow that's suddenly back on a spreadsheet. Connector classification within Power Platform DLP is one of those back-end admin screens most developers never see until it causes a problem. Inside the Power Platform admin portal, every connector, built-in, custom, or premium, gets assigned a category: business, non-business, or blocked. The screenshots from the admin side show a list with 3 columns, but what those labels mean to your project isn't always self-explanatory. Business connectors are supposed to touch company data, typically internal systems or approved platforms like SharePoint and SQL. Non-business means consumer-facing services or anything not officially blessed for business workflows like Twitter or Gmail. And blocked is exactly what it sounds like. Connectors nobody should touch through Power Platform flows. And here's where things slip through the cracks. Many teams roll out custom connectors and leave the classification as whatever the default was when they first published it. Sometimes an admin might slap non-business on a new connector just to play it safe, not realizing it ties the hands of downstream developers. Others forget to update the classification when a connector is proven safe or essential. It's not always clear who owns the decision, especially when connector use crosses app teams. The classic mistake? Failing to align connector classification with real business needs. If a connector absolutely must move critical company data and you label it as non-business, you'll hit a dead end. On the flip side, too many business connectors can create wider data exposure than intended. Scope confusion is another pattern. DLP policies can be set at the environment level. meaning just for your dev, test, or prod space, or up at the tenant level, which covers the whole organization. Developers often test flows in a sandbox where the custom connector is wide open, only to find it blocked in production because the tenant policy is stricter and overrides everything. The Power Platform portal does let you review which connectors are grouped where, but few teams make it a habit to check both environment and tenant scopes before rollout. Mixing connector types in a single flow will consistently trigger DLP violations. For example, if your process pulls customer data from an approved business source like Dataverse, but also posts a notification using a custom connector marked non-business, Power Automate sees that as a policy breach. The flow might disappear from your run history, or worse, allow partial execution without saving data changes, leaving you with messy records and zero traceability. Here's one habit that makes life easier. Treat DLP verification as a checklist item, not an afterthought. Before you move any custom connector into a live project, confirm its classification with your admin team. Review both your environment and tenant policy groups. Make sure your connector's intended use lines up with its label, and check whether any flows are mixing business and non-business endpoints. This one small discipline stops most DLP-induced headaches before they start and keeps your connectors visible when you actually need them. Of course, connectors are only half the DLP puzzle. Even if you get those settings just right, moving between environments comes with its own set of traps for both teams and automations that assume everything will work the same way everywhere. Environment level versus tenant level DLP, the hidden trap. If you've ever moved a flow from development to production and watched it break for no apparent reason, you're living the multi-environment DLP dream. That sinking feeling isn't just bad luck, it's the stuff Power Platform admins trade stories about. Let's talk about environments for a second. In the Power Platform world, environments are like different neighborhoods, development, testing, production, with their own fences and community rules. What's legal on one side of town may get you written up on the other. And nowhere is this more obvious than with DLP policies. Most Power Platform developers get the concept of an environment, even if they haven't set one up themselves. Where things go sideways is the assumption that a working flow means a flow that will always work. Say your dev area has a relaxed DLP setup. Maybe the admin wanted to let you experiment with every connector under the sun. You finish a flow that moves files between SharePoint and your shiny new custom connector, test it a dozen times, and everyone on the team gives you that rare developer approval, ship it. Then come production, the first live run fails, and not just fails, but fails so quietly that users only notice when weekly reports stop arriving. You spend half a day in Power Automate's run history unraveling where it fell apart. The trap every time is forgetting that environments can have their own DLP policies, but tenant-level policies hover above them all like the HOA president you didn't know you had. If the tenant-wide DLP policy is stricter, it will override whatever you set at the environment level. This rarely comes with a big red banner either. A Power Platform doesn't warn you in bold. It just enforces the stricter rule and lets you pick up the pieces. Developers assume if this connector is working in dev, it should be fine in prod. In practice, the DLP policy that matters most is the strictest one in the stack, and that's usually updated centrally. Take the story of a finance team automating invoice processing. Their dev environment lets them pull data from Dataverse into their custom connector for the finance tool, then send notifications via Teams. After weeks of tweaking and successful tests, they deploy it to production. Suddenly, the custom connector fails. What changed? Nothing in the code. It's just that before go live, the security team quietly updated tenant-level DLP settings to block non-Microsoft connectors from accessing financial data in production. None of the warnings from dev showed up, and production users weren't even aware anything changed. The dev environment's policy allowed the connector, but the tenant-level policy did not. The DLP engine picked the higher standards, quietly enforced it, and the flow stopped automating. For anyone not living in the admin center, these differences can feel invisible. But if you look at a side-by-side of a dev environment DLP policy dashboard and a production one, the contrast is clear. The dev policy might show a laundry list of enabled business connectors with only social media blocked for common sense. Flip to the prod dashboard, though, and half the custom connectors and even a few premium Microsoft services are set to non-business or outright blocked. That's not just theoretical. That's the moment your working app hits a wall. The impact isn't limited to a single connector. Flows that cross boundaries between departments or anything using a custom connector labeled differently in prod than in dev are at the highest risk. Flows that handled both HR and finance data with connectors classified as business might hit production only to have one of those connectors reclassified as non-business at the tenant level, instantly triggering a violation without notice. The app works in dev every single time and then evaporates in production, leaving developers chasing a shadow error. So, what's the fix? Instead of crazy troubleshooting after every migration, you need a pre-flight DLP check. Before you push to production, step through a short tip sheet. Confirm that all connectors in your solution have the same classification in both environment and tenant-level DLP policies. Review the tenant dashboard, not just your project's environment. Talk to admins, find out if any policies have changed. If you're about to use a custom connector, double check that its intent matches its classification in both locations. And after all that, test deploy in a mirror of the production environment, even if it means a little extra work up front. This habit is less painful than chasing silent failures when users are already escalating tickets. Of course, even with all the best checks, DLP violations have a knack for sneaking into live flows. Automated tools and policies will only go so far. Sometimes you won't catch every edge case until it's in the wild. Which raises the question, how do you spot these issues before you're troubleshooting for end users in production? Proactive strategies catch DLP issues before they catch you. DLP issues that show up in production aren't just disappointing, they have a way of unraveling everything that looked solid a week before. Even if you've tested flows and connectors a dozen times, getting a DLP error after rollout isn't just a minor annoyance. It can bring down business critical automations for hours or days. The reality is, few things hurt credibility with business users more than a feature that stops working right when they need it, and all you get for root cause is another vague compliance message from Power Platform. The real sticking point is when you find out these DLP problems almost always reveal themselves at the worst possible time. Not in testing, not in a friendly, low-stakes environment where you can fix things in your own time. Most of the time it's live, and someone's dashboard or automated invoice routine grinds to a halt without warning. By the time anyone notices the error, people are already copy-pasting data back into Excel while IT scrambles for answers. Despite all the talk about citizen development and agile delivery, DLP surprises throw a wrench into even well-oiled deployments. It's not just a technical issue, it's a visibility and communication problem. If you really want to run ahead of these failures, detection can't wait until after a flow fails. Early detection and prevention is the only method that gives you leverage. Teams that want to avoid being on call all weekend start their checks long before production. It comes down to two big ideas: using environments to your advantage and treating DLP policies as active parts of change management. Start with test environments that look and feel like production. Same DLP rules, same connector classifications, same tenant settings. A test environment with looser restrictions isn't a testing benefit, it's a false sense of security. For example, if your production DLP policy blocks a custom finance connector from talking to SharePoint, but your test environment allows it, your flow isn't really tested, it's running in a sandbox with the safety filters turned off. When you move to production, the DLP engine picks up the stricter policy and returns the dreaded failure message. So clone the real thing. Match your test settings to production down to the last connector group. Make sure the DLP fence is as high in the test world as it is where the business will actually use the app. Next, schedule regular policy reviews, especially in organizations where DLP policies may shift along with business priorities or compliance requirements. These reviews aren't glamorous, but they stop drift before it becomes technical debt. If you're using Power Platform admin tools, you can pull a snapshot of current DLP policies across environments and line them up side by side. This isn't just busy work. It shows you what's changed and ensures new connectors or even new cloud service integrations aren't flying under the radar with the wrong classification. And if you want to test your flows for DLP violations before go live, don't just hope for the best. Intentionally create mock violations in your test. Flows by combining connectors you know should not be combined according to enterprise policy. Try sending business data from Dataverse to a custom non-business connector. If the DLP engine doesn't flag the violation, that's your signal to double-check your policies. They might not be as strict or as up-to-date as you think. This form of negative testing is basic, but it surfaces policy and environment misalignment before real users are impacted. Power Platform's admin center is your friend here, even if you don't want to spend all day in the admin console. Use the policy simulator features if available, or just manage DLP policies through the Power Platform Center of Excellence Starter Kit, which helps you visualize and analyze usage patterns. Beyond tools, start the DLP discussion with your security and compliance teams at the beginning of a project, not as a last-minute checklist item. They'll help clarify which connectors are off limits, explain the why behind certain rules, and sometimes they can even fast-track exceptions if you're upfront about your business case. For a quick win, enable automated alerts for DLP violations during development, not just in production. Set up flow failure notifications that trigger whenever a run is blocked by policy. This gives your dev team an instant heads up instead of waiting for a business user to spot the fallout first. The earlier you know about blocked connectors or new policy conflicts, the faster you can adjust course. When you're ready to move from gut checks to a real process, build your DLP compliance audit into your go-live routine. Here's a straightforward checklist. First, verify that every connector your solution uses is classified consistently across dev, test, and production environments. Next, scan both environment-level and tenant-level DLP policies for differences. Confirm with admins that no policy changes are scheduled ahead of your launch. Then, simulate a few likely DLP violations to see if your flows properly flag errors. Finally, test run your automations with DLP logging enabled and review the alerts for any surprises. All these steps may sound tedious, but the payoff is solid. Fewer unexpected outages, easier audits, and automation that makes both security teams and business users happy. If you make DLP part of your design and rollout, not just something IT fixes after a ticket, you keep your apps running strong and your users out of troubleshooting mode. But let's be honest, putting these strategies into place isn't just about new processes. There's a whole mindset shift behind them, and that's what decides if DLP becomes a real asset or just another thing to avoid. If you've ever thought DLP policies were just there to slow you down, it's worth seeing them as architectural partners instead. When you approach them as design constraints and not just limits, you catch risks before they become real problems and keep your automations running when it matters. If you've figured out a way to use DLP to solve a real problem, or if you've learned a lesson the hard way, share your story in the comments. In the end, the developers who get ahead are the ones who treat security as a foundation for innovation, not something to dodge.